Greetings, friends. The Boy Scouts of America will change its name to Scouts America next year. On X, some guy called Logan Hall made the comment, "Conservatives love to talk about transgenderism infiltrating female sports, but you hardly ever hear them push back on the decades-long effort to feminize traditional male spaces." So I entered the conversation because I was in the Scouts, although I'm in Canada. Boy Scouts spans more than one country, and that was back in the 90s. And even at that time, the efforts to feminize this space had already begun. We had female leaders at that time just beginning. Now, there were some comments expressed by men who disagreed with the message that scouting has become emasculated. One of them said, quote, "There's nothing about scouting where having two genders involved creates issues like the unbalanced and potentially dangerous scenario of having males compete against females in sports. Conflating the two and being a lughead about it doesn't help fight the real concerning issue." Well, I see this as a related phenomenon. It is different in that males coming into female sports is dangerous for the females in a different way that bringing females into male spaces creates problems. So I said to this guy that it changes everything. It's even worse than having men in women's sports. It's fundamentally a masculine, almost military endeavor to be a scout. To which this guy responded, "That's a fundamentally ignorant understanding of scouting. There's nothing fundamentally masculine about scouting or the skills and values it teaches. Even Sir Baden-Powell said so," and he's referring to the founder of the scouting movement, which was, I guess, around the turn of the 20th century. Now, perhaps Lord Baden-Powell did believe that, but at the time it was a very masculine activity, and that's how it was for most of its history. So I simply asked this guy in response, if that's not fundamentally masculine activity, then what is? And he didn't give me an answer. And I would also ask the question, I didn't get to express this at the time, if Boy Scouts is invaded by girls, are these same people that are okay with this also okay with Girl Guides being invaded by boys? Does that even happen? I mean, it might happen with the troon thing, but does it formally happen? Do just boys go into the Girl Guides? Like, I don't know. I mean, I don't think so. And so my question is, does anyone wonder why this only occurs in one direction? It's always a feminization of the male spaces where many of the female spaces are left feminized, except in the case that's no longer happening because of troons, but the troons believe they're women. Yes, it's kind of the same thing, but they believe they're women. They are playing along with this narrative that they're women, whereas men who are just like, yeah, I'm a man, or can my son go to Girl Guides? Not like you would want him to, but they wouldn't let him because he's a boy, right? But your daughter can go to Scouts now, so that it only occurs in one direction. Okay, here's another guy, and he's commenting on this original post that the Scouts is being emasculated and that male spaces are being invaded by female spaces. And this guy says, "It's not that big of a deal. Some girls think getting to build fires, whittle a stick, and backpack through mountains is fun. There have been female scout leaders for 30 plus years as well. This is nothing more than a name change." And I said to him, well, I was a scout in the 90s when women were just starting to enter as leaders. What's your point that it's been going on for 30 years? It was bad 30 years ago, and it's worse now. It's not just a name change. It's the symbol of this organization no longer being about shaping men to be men. And then another guy responded to me saying that, and he said, well, what does shaping men to be men mean to you? And I said, it means teaching men to be physically tough, to persevere through cold and wet and mosquitoes, to cooperate with other men as a unit, to train with dangerous objects like knives and guns and bows, to respect hierarchy and to be a Christian. In short, it means preparing men for war. And you might think that's a silly thing to say because the Scouts was never about sending men to war, right? That we were just in it for fun, to be boys, right? Back in the 80s or the 90s or the 2000s or whenever you were in Scouts, if you were. It wasn't about war. Well, it actually kind of was about war. It doesn't mean you're going to war, but that warrior spirit has to be cultivated in every man, at least to a little degree. It doesn't mean you're actually going to be a soldier, but you get some of those instincts developed, which are natural to a healthy man anyways. Some of the things I already mentioned there. They make a good army, and it has to do with your country. Do you care about your country? Do you care about your faith? If you do, you would want to be a strong man and defend it. So one of these guys that I was conversing with responded, he said that I would serve well under a king, but to him, being a man, it means to provide, survive, and protect, which I don't necessarily disagree with. And then he said that women scout leaders gave boys of single mothers exposure to positive role models and those ideals. He says he wouldn't begrudge young girls learning these ideals either. I asked him, so men are the natural providers and protectors then? I agree with that. However, I don't agree that boys raised by single mothers need women scout leaders. They're already surrounded by female authority in daycare and in the school. The boys who are around single mothers are the ones who need male scout leaders the most. They're the ones who need an all-male organization the most. And then we get another one of these guys responding to me. He says, being a man does not mean being a Christian. There's no debating that. As for the rest of what I said, he doesn't see why girls should not also learn these things. He says, cooperation is not a segregated thing. And kids should never be groomed for the meat grinder. He's referring to going to war. I didn't respond to his comment on the meat grinder, but I could have said that you can support training men for war, in other words, fulfilling their natural instincts to defend family and tribe, without supporting the meat grinder, meaning the military-industrial complex, which sends men to die for no good reason. But I did say to him, traditionally in the West, the man was head of the family and God was over him. But if you're going to say everything men traditionally did, women should do, then let me ask you, what makes a man? How is he different than a woman? And he said men and women can share ideals and sometimes step into a role primarily dominated by the other, but no one is a slave to any given role. You are free to choose what ideals shape you, or at least you can try. Instincts are strong, but not indomitable. So he didn't really answer what a man was. He's willing to say, oh, well, scouting, it's not essentially masculine, but then you ask them, well, what is? And they don't give you an answer. These people are willing to deconstruct, they're not willing to construct. They don't know how to build. They can only deconstruct, subvert things, dissolve things. One of the guys said to me, without women scout leaders, those kids, meaning those with single mothers, those boys with single mothers, would never have had the chance to even be in scouts. It was important to them that they could be involved, but scouts, I guess he's saying it was important to these boys that these females, these women, could be involved as scout leaders. But the scouting organization never stopped doing scout things because these women were around. Well, that's an assertion. I would not necessarily agree with that. But I asked him, why would boys raised by single mothers not have had a chance to be in scouts unless there were female leaders? And scouts did change their behavior with the entrance of women, just like happens elsewhere when women enter male spaces. Some things that come to mind are the following. The things men would discuss normally in conversation would change. They'd be aware that females would listen and possibly report them for politically incorrect speech. They'd also have to use more effort to keep girls safe and comfortable. And I could think of other things, but that's just a start. So I asked the last guy who said that men and women can share ideals, but they can step into each other's roles. I asked him, do you happen to be female or a male who was raised by a single mother? I mean, I'm assuming this guy's a guy. I mean, it sounded like he was, but are you female or are you a guy who was raised by a single mother? Why should we go against our natural instincts? He just admitted that instincts are strong. Why should we go against them? And aren't we enslaved to our biology in some degree? Men cannot give birth, women can give birth. There are other significant biological differences which impact our roles in society. And again, he didn't really respond to me after this. Why is this idea of the slave coming up again? The feminists, they characterize patriarchy as this psychopathic, total sadistic control of the man over the woman. And these guys who are defending women coming into the scouting organization, they're saying that to maintain traditional gender roles and keep women out of scouting, this would be like slavery, basically. It's just such an extreme position. How do you just jump to slavery? They want this like radical freedom, and they paint anything that doesn't give them that radical freedom as slavery. It's such an extreme, distorted view, and I don't think it's in good faith at all. So in summary, I'll just go over some of the reasons why scouting is masculine, as I've already described, but I might speak from my own personal experience. I was in Beavers the full, 3 or 4 years or however long it is, and then I was in Cub Scouts. I guess that's another 4 years. And then I was in the Scouts. I didn't finish Scouts, but I was in it for at least 3 years. So at least up until the age of around 12 or 13. And then around that age, I just kind of got bored of it and I didn't complete it. But I do have some positive memories with it. I had friends in Scouting, and I remember going to the camps, and we'd do hiking, we'd cook our own food, we were divided into patrols. We would go on this week-long camp in the summertime at a place called Halliburton, where each patrol had total independence. Like there were leaders around in case, any emergency, but generally we were given a budget. We had to take the boat to the store, which was a long journey, and then buy the food at the store with our budget, and then go back and then cook the food, ration the food, do the dishes, divide activities. And we would be staying in this tent, several tents for, multiple nights. And during the day, there were activities like survival course stuff. That's the first time I got to fire a gun, a .22 caliber rifle. They had archery. They had other stuff. And there was a lot of free time. And we would explore it, and we're very creative, and some guys they used rope to tie together several canoes to make like what's it called, a bimaran or a trimaran or a catamaran or something like that, where and then we would go exploring on these other islands, like completely unsupervised by adults. Sometimes these things turned into war games. I'd say maybe that was slightly when we were younger, the younger scouts, but this sort of like violent instinct could come out, and but it was kept under control, but there was a certain healthy expression of war games, because we'd be exploring, and then some kids were a bit hyperactive. You don't know what they're going to do. Maybe the next thing you know, the older kids are at war with the younger kids. That's kind of how it would go. Nothing too bad, but I remember like some kid was running through the woods once, and he tripped and he fell on a stick, and he gashed his leg pretty bad. So that stuff could happen, but that's all good fun, that's all good memories. And the idea of being in the darkness, away from civilization, toughing the elements, the rain, the insects, coming to enjoy that stuff. We were introduced to very watered down Christianity, very just the tiny little semblance, but I mean, compared to how things are now in our society, it wasn't a bad influence. I can imagine it would have been much different like half a century ago or before World War II. I remember in the church building that we rented for our meetings, for my troop, there was like a painting of Lord Baden-Powell, the founder of Scouts, and like an apparition of Jesus Christ. It was kind of like goofy Protestant kind of art, but it still had an effect. It was like this apparition behind Lord Baden-Powell, like laying his hand on Lord Baden's shoulder to, give him support, I guess. So there was a lot of good things. Also scouting, that's when we started doing the reenacting, and we would go to Fort George and we would reenact like the British Army, and then the American Scouts, they would reenact the American Army during the War of 1812, and we'd have these like mock battles. So it introduced you to history in that way. There was a lot of really good influences in Scouts. Like you're not getting that influence in the public school system. You weren't getting it in the 90s in the public school system. I can't imagine what it would be like now in the 2020s. For a 10-year-old, for a 9-year-old in the public school system, like it's got to be the most feminizing, safe space ever. Any sort of healthy masculine expression would be constantly snipped right off immediately. Even before the pandemic, when they forced kids to wear masks and totally stifle their development emotionally and psychologically, even before that, it was an extremely feminized space, as are all the institutions, as is the mainstream society right now in the West. It's extremely feminized and emasculated. Any man who disagrees with this is not helping himself. He's not helping our society. You have to just face it. Yes, we live in an emasculated world. Let's try to preserve what we have left of the old world. Changing Boy Scouts to only Scouts is not just a name change. It signifies a greater pattern, which is the emasculation of our men. Hasta luego, amigos.